Welcome to today's lecture. We will be discussing traumatic brain injuries, the effects on the individual and their families, and how that impacts their attendance in the school setting. As the banner shows there, traumatic brain injuries certainly are a drastic, sudden change for the life of the individual involved in an accident serious enough to induce traumatic brain injury. These types of injuries are impartial. One simply has to be involved in a serious accident where the brain takes a severe impact. And so if school wasn't hard enough for your average individual, somebody who has suffered a traumatic brain injury certainly will face additional challenges emotionally, socially, academically. But there are plans in place. Fortunately, trained professionals and caregivers, hospital staff, all work together to support these students as they continue their academic career. The Individuals with Disabilities Act, also known as IDEA, does consider a traumatic brain injury a learning disorder. So it is treated as such, falling under special education services, complete with individual education programs or 504 plans, and in less severe cases, response to intervention will be incorporated to assist these students with their academic needs. We'll also take a look at the available support networks and services that are available for teachers and students and the parents or caregivers of these children. And we'll be taking a look at, in the classroom setting, adaptations and accommodations for these students, modifications to coursework, for example, instructional strategies that have been proven successful for working with students with traumatic brain injuries. And we'll also be taking a look at the available assistive technology that's out there for these students. If we take a look at defining traumatic brain injuries from an education standpoint, the Individuals with Disabilities Act defines TBI as an acquired injury to the brain caused by an external physical force resulting in total or partial functional disability or psychosocial impairment, or both, that adversely affects a child's educational performance. There are many definitions of traumatic brain injuries, and all of them are relatively similar. As I was researching, they reminded me sort of snowflakes. Scientifically speaking, there are no two snowflakes that are absolutely identical, even though they can be extremely similar in appearance. The definitions of traumatic brain injury are similar. For example, the Brain Injury Association, which is a national advocacy group for people with brain injuries, they define traumatic brain injury as an insult to the brain, not of degenerative or congenital nature, caused by an external physical force that may produce a diminished or altered state of consciousness, and which results in an impairment of cognitive abilities or physical functioning. It can also result in the disturbance of behavioral or emotional functioning. One thing I want to make clear, all definitions of traumatic brain injury emphasize the fact that TBI, it's not a case of brain degeneration, and it also is not something that an individual is born with. TBI is the direct result of some form of severe impact to the brain. And also, I would like to point out how traumatic brain injuries and the students, I'm sure adults as well, but students oftentimes will struggle or develop new behaviors and emotional outbursts. This is something I've experienced firsthand, and I guess scary would be the word. I had one student I've worked with who had crashed his four-wheeler probably 5 or 6 years ago, suffered a traumatic brain injury, was in a classroom with some friends, and they were kind of giving him some good-natured ribbing, and it seemed like it was going just fine, and all of a sudden he burst out screaming and threatening that he was going to stab every single one of them. Needless to say, we quickly exited the room and went for a walk, and I got to the bottom of it, that he really didn't want to hurt anybody. It was just a completely impulsive, spur-of-the-moment, spontaneous outburst. We moved on with the day, but there were several other occasions throughout this past school year where he would just blurt out completely inappropriate and scary things. And of course, the school counselor was involved and the principal. And like I say, I don't believe there was any ill intent on his behalf, but just kind of scary how those things can just pop up as a result of these traumatic brain injuries. Traumatic brain injuries cover such a wide array of deficits as a result, depending on whether the brain injury is mild, such as a concussion, maybe playing sports or falling off your bike without a helmet on, to the most extreme cases that result in paralysis or death. One alarming statistic is that traumatic brain injuries are the most common cause of death and disability in young people. And for a guy who grew up despising and never wearing bike helmets, I now, as an adult, officially should be a member of the bicycle police. I'm always getting after nieces and nephews and daughters to put their bike helmets on. It's such a simple thing, and these traumatic brain injuries can happen so easily. So any preventative measures one can take is strongly advised. It's hard to describe common characteristics of traumatic brain injuries because there are so many different side effects. One of the maybe more noticeable characteristics would have to do with emotional functioning, and that goes both ways as far as one's own emotional control and the ability or inability to recognize emotions in others, which can pose a problem in school. If kids aren't readily aware of their own emotions, or they're not recognizing emotional cues from others, this can result in anger and aggression, depression, reduced emotional and behavioral self-control, sort of like I mentioned with the young man I've worked with in the past. Memory problems are quite common, both short and long term. Attention span, and that I think often is associated with the fatigue after a traumatic brain injury. It can take a significant amount of time to regain the stamina to attend the whole school day, no less partial day. And so many of these characteristics you see on this list probably occur in some form or fashion with a traumatic brain injury. It just depends on the injury, on which of these are going to be the major impairments in a student's day-to-day activities. When we look at assessing a student who is returning to school after suffering a traumatic brain injury, one of the key elements is going to be open communication between hospital staff, the parents and caregivers, teachers, and if applicable, very important to include the student. And really, all of those people are going to take a look at what are the student's abilities, what are his or her impairments, and they'll also want to take a look at setting some goals. And everything with traumatic brain injuries really is dependent upon the severity of the injury. The length of time for recovery will vary, and in some of the more extreme cases, a student may never fully recover from the traumatic brain injury. So if we're looking at a student who is maybe on the more mild end of traumatic brain injury, that student might be looking at a response to intervention type situation where they are receiving some additional help within the general education classroom. I'm thinking along the lines of a concussion, where a student just is going to need some additional time to complete assignments or to complete tests, or maybe a dimly lit corner of the classroom if they're suffering from light sensitivity. And if we look at the other end of the spectrum, the severe traumatic brain injury, that student very well might end up in an intensive special education setting where they are completely removed from the general education classroom. And as is always the goal and the hope, is to have these students continue to regain more and more abilities, and to get them back into the general education setting. But like has been discussed already, there's such a wide range of traumatic brain injuries that it's impossible to pinpoint a timeline for anything, really. When we look at working with students with TBI in the classroom, one of the first considerations we should take into account is for fatigue. And this could range anywhere from homebound instruction to maybe partial days, or we could look at giving them a less demanding course load, maybe restructuring their daily schedule. But fatigue often plays a big part, especially when students are first returning after a serious accident. We can also look at rearranging the room. On occasion, we would have to plan to accommodate for a student in a wheelchair, or maybe using a walker, or even a motorized scooter. But those are things we would want to consider as that student returns. The traumatic brain injury, it's such a huge adjustment for a child. I mean, we could have a student who was an honors band member and can no longer even hold their instrument. Maybe the a basketball player who is unable to participate in his or her favorite sport anymore. And there can be a lot of anger associated with this sudden, drastic change to their lifestyle. So another common and appropriate accommodation is develop an exit plan for these students. Odds are they're going to at some point have some emotional or behavioral issues, and how appropriate to give them the opportunity to leave their room, give them a chance to cool off. They're going to be dealing with this change to their life for the foreseeable future, and it's just an appropriate situation to allow them time. Give them time to, if they need to leave the room in order to avoid making a scene. I think that's an excellent idea. As far as modifying coursework, we've mentioned before to allow extra time to complete assignments and tests. It's common to break down complex tasks into smaller steps so it's not such an overwhelming hurdle to complete bigger projects. It's also a good idea to teach the student how to use a day planner to help keep them organized, and this will also assist with newfound memory deficits that the child may be experiencing. And I don't know if this would be accommodation or modification, but light sensitivity is a common issue with traumatic brain injuries. So maybe setting up a corner of the room where there's lamp light only, or they're shielded from the awful fluorescent lighting. But something to take into consideration is the light sensitivity the child may be experiencing. There are many instructional strategies, and a lot of these are going to be similar to working with students with any learning or behavior disorder, but the student with traumatic brain injury would benefit from using graphic organizers. Maybe the teacher gives the student his or her notes, and again, time, allowing these students more time to do just about everything. And another thing I came across that I thought would be really valuable is to give the student material early, to give them a chance to know what is going to be covered in class prior to the class actually happening. And the benefits here are twofold. The student will definitely be more interested in class. They won't feel as lost. They're already struggling with attention and memory. But if they have the material early, it will give them the chance to participate potentially in class discussions, which is a huge socialization piece, that they can feel part of the class. Other strategies, you want to maybe allow the student to use notes or calculator on tests, and anything that would help them overcome some of the deficits they're experiencing as a result of TBI. We've covered some of the assistive technology already: wheelchairs, walkers, electric scooters. Other things would include tape recorders, calculators, electronic spellers, computers, augmentative communication devices, timers, alarms, and beepers. With traumatic brain injury, it's highly important that teachers and students and caregivers and hospital providers work together to support each other and keep each other informed. There are professional organizations that are available as resources to help. The Brain Injury Association of America is one that provides assistance to caregivers and professionals and people who have suffered traumatic brain injuries. The Centers for Disease Control is a wealth of information, And the Family Caregiver Alliance is dedicated to providing assistance to family and friends of those requiring long-term care.